Blood tasted like copper and regrets. As the pavement rushed up to meet my face, my last thought wasn't of family or unfulfilled dreams. It was of Brenda, smiling in her designer suit, while security marched me out of the lobby. She stole my life, and I let her. But death didn't want me. Instead, I woke up 3 months earlier, sitting at my cubicle, hearing her expensive heels clicking toward my desk. This time, I'm not fixing her mistakes. I'm giving her enough rope to hang herself. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a persistent, mechanical hum that vibrated right behind my eyes. I gasped, my hand slamming flat against the cheap laminate of my desk. My lungs heaved. I expected the agonizing crush of steel, the freezing rain, the sickening snap of my own ribs. Instead, I smelled stale drip coffee and toner. I stared at my hands. There was no blood, no road grit embedded in my palms. My fingernails were perfectly manicured, coated in a sensible, boring, neutral polish. Slowly, I lifted my head. The beige walls of my cubicle boxed me in. A calendar pinned to the partition read, May 14th. My breath hitched. May 14th, the day it all started. Panic sharp and icy spiked through my veins. I clicked my mouse, waking up my monitor. The digital clock in the corner of the screen confirmed it. It was exactly 3 months before my termination. 3 months before the eviction. 3 months before I took a miserable gig, delivering food in a thunderstorm, just to make rent, only to get T-boned by a drunk driver at a blind intersection. Jess, Earth to Jess, you in there. The voice was like nails on a chalkboard, coated in artificial honey. I froze. The hair on my arms stood up. I knew that voice intimately. It was the voice that had testified against me in the HR boardroom. The voice that had feigned tears while tossing me into a wood chipper to save her own skin. I turned my chair. Brenda stood, leaning against my partition. She looked immaculate. A crisp, tailored ivory blazer, a silk emerald blouse, and a smile that didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes. In my past life, my first life, I guess I had looked at her with a mix of awe and envy. Brenda was everything I wasn't. Loud, confident, ruthless. She was the golden child of the regional accounts division. I was just the quiet, reliable workhorse. The girl who stayed late to clean up the messes. You look like you've seen a ghost, babe. Brenda set her perfectly threaded brows, furrowing in mock concern. Just a headache, I managed to say. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears. Steady, calm. Not the frantic, panicked squeak of the pushover I used to be. Well, pop an aspirin because I need a massive favor. She didn't wait for my consent. She slid a sleek silver USB drive across my desk. It clattered against my keyboard. I've been going over the quarterly vendor payouts, and the formatting on the raw data is a total nightmare. The system must have glitched when I exported it. Nothing aligns. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. The glitch. In my previous life, I had taken that USB drive with a tired sigh. I had stayed until 9 p.m., parsing through thousands of rows of data. I had found the glitch, a massive discrepancy in the accounts payable. Over $200,000 routed to a vendor named Apex Solutions, a company I didn't recognize. Thinking it was a genuine database error, a simple duplication mistake, I had manually reconciled the numbers, smoothing out the ledger so the department wouldn't fail the Friday audit. I had fixed it using my secure login, my IP address, my digital fingerprints. When the corporate auditors eventually found the missing money, they didn't look at Brenda. They looked at the system logs. They saw Jessica Miller manually altering financial records to balance the books. Brenda played the shocked, betrayed supervisor perfectly. She claimed I must have been embezzling and tried to cover my tracks when I realized an audit was coming. I was fired, blacklisted from the industry, facing potential criminal charges, utterly bankrupt, and destroyed, all because Apex Solutions wasn't a glitch. It was a shell company registered to Brenda's brother-in-law. "It's just formatting," I asked, looking down at the silver drive. I wanted to smash it. I wanted to reach across the desk and wrap my hands around her throat. Just a total mess. Brenda sighed, examining a cuticle. "You're so much better at Excel than I am, Jess. You have that brain for it. The little details. If you could just massage the numbers so they match the master ledger by Friday, I'd owe you my life. I'd owe you my life." A bitter, cynical smile pulled at the corner of my mouth. I looked up at her, really looking at her. I saw the slight tension in her shoulders, the microscopic bead of sweat near her hairline. She was scared. The audit was looming, and she knew she had gotten sloppy. She needed a patsy. "Sure, Brenda," I said, my voice eerily soft. "Leave it with me. I'll make sure the numbers reflect exactly what happened." Relief washed over her face, immediate and obvious. "You are an absolute lifesaver. I'll buy you lunch next week. Promise." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a rhythmic, arrogant beat down the carpeted aisle. I sat in silence for a long time. I reached out and picked up the USB drive. The metal was cool against my skin. I wasn't the same girl who had taken this drive last time. That girl was dead on a rain-slicked highway. I plugged the drive into my tower. The notification chimed. I wasn't going to fix her glitch. I was going to document it. The office buzzed around me, oblivious to the war that had just been declared in Cubicle 4B. Phones rang. Keyboards clattered. Someone down the hall laughed loudly at a terrible joke. I sat perfectly still, staring at the raw data sprawling across my dual monitors. Row 450, row 812, row 1105. There they were, the fraudulent invoices, disguised as routine consulting fees and software licensing renewals. They were buried deep, scattered randomly among legitimate payouts to hide the pattern. Brenda wasn't a master criminal, but she was cunning. She knew that our boss David only looked at the bottom line aggregates. He never drilled down into individual line items. As long as the total expenditure matched the projected budget, David signed off and went back to his golf magazines. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The urge to immediately march into David's office and throw the drive on his desk was overwhelming, but I stopped myself. I had to think logically. I had to think like a predator. If I went to David now, it was my word against Brenda's. She was a senior account manager. I was a junior data analyst. She was charismatic, well-liked, and pulled in major clients. I was the quiet girl who ate a turkey sandwich at her desk every day. She would claim I misunderstood the data, or worse, she'd flip the script early and say I had generated those invoices. The USB drive had no metadata, proving she created the files. She was smart enough to scrub the author properties before handing it to me. I needed an ironclad paper trail. I needed her to hang herself. First, I opened a hidden encrypted folder on my personal cloud drive. I couldn't use the company server. IT could wipe that in a heartbeat if HR demanded it. I dragged the original unedited file into the cloud. Next, I opened my company email. I drafted a message to Brenda. "Hi, Brenda. Just confirming receipt of the vendor data. USB. you dropped off at my desk regarding the formatting errors. I'm looking at the discrepancies, now specifically the recurring entries for Apex Solutions. Since they don't have standard vendor ID tags, do you want me to manually reconcile them to match the master ledger as you requested? Best Jess. I hit send. Then I waited. My stomach churned with a toxic mix of anxiety and adrenaline. This was the bait. If she called me on the phone or walked over to my desk to answer verbally, she was being cautious. If she replied via email, her arrogance had overridden her caution. 10 minutes passed. I busied myself by opening a blank spreadsheet, making it look like I was hard at work. I felt a shadow fall over my desk. Hey Jess, it was Greg from accounting. He held a coffee mug plastered with a faded cartoon logo. Greg was decent, tired, overworked, but honest. In my past life, Greg had been the only one who looked at me with pity as I packed my cardboard box. He hadn't spoken up for me, but he hadn't cheered for my downfall either. Hey, Greg, what's up? Just wondering if you're pulling the Q2 projections today? He said, taking a slow sip. David is breathing down my neck for the overhead variances. I can have them to you by 3, I replied. Greg nodded, looking past me to my screen. You doing vendor payouts? Thought Brenda handled the initial scrub. She does, I said smoothly. She just asked me to look over a few formatting issues. Greg snorted. Formatting issues. Right. Translated, she dumped her grunt work on you so she could browse Zillow. I saw her looking at beach houses in Cabo earlier. Cabo. So that's what 200 grand bought you. My jaw tightened, but I forced a light chuckle. You know how it is. Team player and all that. Don't let her walk all over you, Jess, Greg muttered, turning to leave. She's a shark, and sharks only care about their next meal. I know, I thought, watching him walk away. I've already been eaten once. A sharp ping from my computer pulled my attention back. An email notification. It was from Brenda. I clicked it open, holding my breath. Hey, babe. Yes, exactly. Don't worry about the missing vendor. IDs for Apex. They are a legacy contractor, and the system always spits their tags out wrong. Just manually adjust the cells so the final columns balance for David's Friday review. You're a star. I exhaled a long, shaky breath. A genuine, terrifying smile spread across my face. She did it. She put the instruction to alter financial records in writing. She confirmed her knowledge of the dummy company. I immediately took a screenshot of the email, capturing the time and date stamp. I saved the email as a PDF and uploaded both to my encrypted cloud folder. I forwarded the email to my personal secure Proton Mail account for good measure. The trap was set. Now I just had to play the waiting game. Instead of altering the file as instructed, I created a duplicate. I spent the next 3 hours doing exactly what she asked. On the dummy file, I balanced the books. I hid the fraud. I made the numbers sing a beautiful, deceptive song. I saved it on the USB drive. But the original file, the one with the glaring bleeding wounds of her embezzlement, I sent that directly to the corporate auditing team's anonymous tip portal, scheduled to deliver at 8 a.m. on Friday, just 2 hours before David's review meeting. At 4:45 p.m., I walked over to Brenda's glass-walled office. She was on her phone, laughing loudly. When she saw me, she held up a manicured finger, signaling for me to wait. I stood there, perfectly content. She hung up and beamed at me. Tell me good news, Jess. I placed the silver USB drive on her pristine glass desk. All done. The formatting is fixed, and the bottom line balances perfectly with the master ledger. Smooth sailing for Friday. Brenda let out a dramatic sigh of relief, dropping the drive into her designer purse. I literally love you. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'll never have to find out, I said quietly, holding her gaze. She blinked a brief flash of confusion, crossing her features at my tone, but her vanity quickly dismissed it. Right. Well, have a great night. See you tomorrow. See you Friday, Brenda. I walked out of the building. The evening air was cool and crisp. There was no rain, no screeching tires, just the steady rhythmic heartbeat in my chest, beating a countdown to Friday morning. Wednesday dragged like a wounded animal. The air in the office felt suffocating heavy, with the weight of what I knew and what was coming. I spent the day playing the perfect, docile subordinate. When Brenda strolled in 40 minutes late, clutching a massive iced coffee and complaining loudly about the traffic on the interstate, I didn't roll my eyes. I nodded sympathetically. When she dropped a stack of disorganized, coffee-stained expense receipts on my keyboard and asked me to alphabetize them because her nails were drying, I simply said, "No problem." Every time I looked at her, I saw the blinding headlights of the truck that had ended my previous life. I saw the eviction notice pinned to my apartment door. I felt the agonizing, hollow panic of sitting in the HR office while she lied through her perfectly whitened teeth. Keeping my rage buried was a physical effort. It sat in the back of my throat, tasting like ash. Around noon, Greg paused by my cubicle. He held 2 foil-wrapped sandwiches and tossed one onto my desk. Turkey and Swiss. "You look like you're going to murder someone, Jess," he said, pulling up a spare chair. "Take a break. Eat." I forced my facial muscles to relax. Just focused. Friday's review is coming up. "Yeah, well, David is already in a mood," Greg muttered around a mouthful of bread. "Corporate has been riding his case about our division's overhead. He actually yelled at the copier this morning." I filed that information away. David was feeling the pressure from above. That made him dangerous, but it also made him vulnerable. If a massive discrepancy was uncovered, his first instinct wouldn't be to investigate quietly. It would be to panic and cover his own ass. He would want a scapegoat immediately. In my past life, that scapegoat was me. This time, I had already built the cage for the real culprit. Brenda seems relaxed. At least, I noted casually, peeling the foil back from my sandwich. Greg scoffed. "Brenda is operating on a different planet. Did you see the new bag she brought in today? That's a $3,000 piece of leather. On a senior manager's salary, unless she's got a sugar daddy. She isn't mentioning the math. Doesn't math." My heart did a strange, erratic flutter. Greg noticed the discrepancy in her lifestyle. If Greg noticed it, others probably did too. It was a thread I could pull if things got messy. Thursday arrived with a sudden terrifying complication. At 10 a.m., an automated email popped up from the IT department. Mandatory server maintenance and security sweep at 1 p.m. All local drives will be scanned for unauthorized software and non-compliant file structures. Cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My encrypted cloud folder was secure, but the temporary duplicate files I had created to build the timeline were still lingering in my computer's recycle bin. If IT ran a deep diagnostic, they might flag the raw, unaltered Apex Solutions data sitting alongside the doctored files I had returned to Brenda. I had exactly 3 hours to scrub my digital footprint down to the bare metal. I abandoned my actual work. I went into the command prompt, running manual deletion scripts to overwrite the sectors of the hard drive where the temporary files had lived. I purged the cache. I deleted my browser history. I even wiped the Slack messages between myself and Greg, just in case. I needed to look like a ghost. By 12:45 p.m., my machine was clean. I leaned back in my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. Jess, I jumped my knee, slamming into the underside of the desk. Brenda was standing there, holding a glossy travel brochure. "You okay? You look pale," she said. But she wasn't actually looking at me. She was admiring her own reflection in the darkened screen of my second monitor. "Fine. Just skipped breakfast." "Well, make sure you're sharp for tomorrow," she said, leaning in. Her perfume was overwhelming, something floral and expensive that choked the air out of my cubicle. "David is going to want to see the vendor payouts first thing." I told him I personally oversaw the reconciliation, but I need you in the room to answer any granular tech questions if he gets nosy about the software glitches. My blood ran cold. She was dragging me into the boardroom. She wasn't just going to present the forged numbers. She was going to use me as a physical shield. If David asked a hard question, she would pivot to me. Jess handled the data entry David asked her. "I'll be there," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat. "I've got everything documented." "Perfect," she smiled, tapping the brochure against my desk. "By the way, I'm thinking of taking next week off. A little trip to the Bahamas. You can handle the daily reports while I'm gone, right?" "Sure, Brenda. Take all the time you need." She walked away, humming under her breath. I watched her go, my hands curled into tight fists under the desk. She was planning a vacation on the money she stole, fully expecting me to hold down the fort and take the fall if the walls ever caved in. I opened my secure Proton Mail account on my phone. The scheduled email was still sitting in the outbox. Addressed to Corporate Audit, the VP of Finance, and the anonymous whistleblower tip line. Attached was the raw data, the screenshot of Brenda's email explicitly instructing me to alter the records. A clear, undeniable map of her shell company. Delivery time: Friday, 8 a.m. I locked my phone and slid it into my pocket. Tomorrow, Brenda wouldn't be booking a flight to the Bahamas. She would be calling a lawyer. Sleep was a luxury I abandoned completely on Thursday night. I sat on the floor of my cramped apartment, staring at the digital clock on my microwave. Every red glowing number felt like a physical blow. 3 a.m., 4:15 a.m., 5:30 a.m. I showered in water so hot it turned my skin pink. I dressed meticulously, not the oversized cardigans and scuffed flats of the girl who died on the highway. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer I had bought at a thrift store and spent hours altering by hand. I wore sharp black trousers. I pulled my hair back into a tight, unforgiving knot. I looked like a woman going to a funeral. In a way, I was. I arrived at the office at 7:15 a.m. The parking lot was mostly empty, shrouded in a thin layer of coastal fog. The building was quiet, save for the hum of the HVAC system. I walked to my desk, turned on my computer, and waited. At 7:45 a.m., Greg shuffled in, clutching his oversized coffee mug like a lifeline. He gave me a tired nod. A few other early birds trickled in. At 7:55 a.m., I opened my personal email on my phone. I watched the outbox. 5 minutes, my mouth was dry. I took a sip of water, but it tasted like dust. What if the email bounced? What if corporate compliance ignored it? What if Brenda had somehow gotten to the auditors first? The doubts swarmed like hornets, threatening to paralyze me. I forced myself to breathe. 4 seconds in, hold, For 4. Out for 4. 8 a.m. The screen on my phone blinked. The email vanished from the outbox. Sent. I let out a breath. I felt like I had been holding for 3 months. It was done. The digital bomb was in the mail. Now, it was just a matter of who opened it first. At 8:15 a.m., David arrived. He looked flustered, carrying his briefcase and a cardboard tray of coffees. He walked briskly past the bullpen and shut his office door. At 8:30 a.m., the atmosphere in the office shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a distinct drop in pressure. I saw David's assistant, a nervous kid named Mark, practically run to the printer, snatch a stack of papers, and sprint back into David's office. A moment later, the blinds on David's glass walls snapped shut. Greg looked over his partition, frowning. "What's going on in the fishbowl? David never shuts his blinds." "Maybe a bad call with corporate," I said, casually, keeping my eyes on my spreadsheet. At 8:45 a.m., Brenda made her grand entrance. She was wearing a stunning crimson dress that practically screamed for attention. She looked radiant, untouchable. She walked past my desk, dropping a heavily modified latte near my keyboard. "Morning, Jess, big day," she chirped. "Meeting is at 9:30. Bring the USB." "I have it right here," I said, tapping my pocket. She smiled, a predatory, self-satisfied smirk, and walked into her office. She left her door wide open, settling into her plush leather chair to check her makeup in a compact mirror. She had no idea the ground beneath her had already collapsed. At 9:05 a.m., the elevator doors at the end of the hall chimed. I looked up. 3 people stepped out. They weren't wearing the standard business casual of our regional branch. They wore severe dark suits, 2 men and 1 woman. They carried locked briefcases. They bypassed the receptionist, completely, their faces grim and set in stone. The woman in the lead walked directly to David's office and knocked twice before opening the door without waiting for an answer. The bullpen went dead silent. Keyboards stopped clattering. Greg slowly lowered his coffee mug. "Who are they?" someone whispered, 2 rows down. "Corporate," Greg replied, softly, his eyes wide. "That's Sarah Jenkins, head of internal audit. They only come down from Chicago if someone is getting walked out." My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my throat. The trap had snapped shut. 10 agonizing minutes passed. The entire floor pretended to work, but every eye was locked on David's closed door. We could hear muffled voices, not the words, but the cadence. David's voice, high-pitched and defensive. The auditor's voice, flat and unyielding. Then, David's door flew open. David stood there, his face completely drained of color. He looked like he was about to be sick. He scanned the bullpen, his eyes darting frantically until they landed on Brenda's open office door. "Sikits, Brenda!" David's voice cracked. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Brenda looked up from her computer, visibly startled by his tone. She forced a laugh, standing up and smoothing her crimson skirt. "Everything okay, David? We have our review in 20 minutes. "Now," David barked. Brenda's smile faltered. For the first time since I had woken up in this timeline, I saw genuine fear flicker in her eyes. She grabbed her notebook and walked out of her office, the click of her heels entirely lacking their usual arrogant rhythm. As she passed my desk, she paused. She looked at me, an unspoken question in her eyes. "Did you fix the glitch?" I looked back at her. I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I just stared at her with dead cold eyes. She swallowed hard and walked into David's office. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind her, echoing like a gunshot across the silent floor. Minutes stretched into hours. At least that's how it felt in the bullpen. Nobody was typing. Nobody was on the phone. The collective gaze of 25 employees remained glued to the frosted glass of David's office. We were a jury, waiting for a verdict we couldn't hear. Next to me, Greg ripped a paperclip into tiny, jagged pieces. "Someone is getting fired," he murmured, barely moving his lips. "Jenkins doesn't fly out here to hand down performance improvement plans. She's the Grim Reaper of regional branches." I kept my eyes on my dual monitors. My screensaver bounced a generic company logo from corner to corner. I tracked it breathing in a steady, calculated rhythm. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. The panic of my past life tried to claw its way up my throat, a phantom memory of sitting in that exact room, crying, pleading, watching David refuse to meet my eyes, while Brenda patted my arm with mock sympathy. Not this time, I reminded myself. The armor is on. At exactly 9:22 a.m., David's door opened again. Mark, his young assistant, stepped out. He looked completely shell-shocked. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat, and walked straight toward my cubicle. The bullpen grew impossibly quieter. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. "Jess," Mark squeaked. He cleared his throat and tried again, aiming for a professional register. "Jessica, David needs you in his office. Bring whatever files you were working on for the quarterly review." Greg shot me a look of pure, unadulterated pity. He thought I was collateral damage. He thought Brenda had just handed me over as the sacrificial lamb to appease the Chicago auditors. "Sure," I said, my voice remarkably even. I unplugged the silver USB drive from my tower. I stood up, smoothing the wrinkles from my charcoal trousers. I didn't rush. I walked down the carpeted aisle with the measured, deliberate pace of an executioner ascending the scaffold. I felt the eyes of my co-workers on my back. I ignored them. I stepped into David's office, and the heavy door clicked shut behind me, sealing us in. The air conditioning in here was cranked to freezing, but David was sweating. Dark, wet patches stained the underarms of his expensive blue button-down. He sat behind his massive mahogany desk, looking 20 years older than he had yesterday. Sarah Jenkins sat opposite him. She was severe, wearing a black suit with zero jewelry. Her gray hair was cut into a sharp bob. Beside her sat the two silent men with their locked briefcases. And then there was Brenda. She sat in the leather guest chair, her legs crossed tightly. Her posture was rigidly perfect, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the armrests. Her crimson dress, which had looked so powerful 30 minutes ago, now just made her look like a target. "Jessica," David started, his voice wavering slightly. He cleared his throat. "Please take a seat." I sat down in the empty chair next to Brenda. She didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead at Sarah Jenkins. "Ms. Miller," Sarah said, her tone devoid of any warmth. "My name is Sarah Jenkins. I am the Director of Internal Audit. We are currently reviewing the Q2 vendor payouts for this regional branch. A severe discrepancy has been brought to our attention regarding a vendor labeled Apex Solutions." She paused, letting the silence hang. It was an interrogation tactic. I knew it. Brenda knew it. Brenda cracked first. As I was just explaining to Sarah, Brenda interjected, her voice artificially sweet, coated in a thick layer of forced calm. I caught the formatting errors in the raw data pull on Monday. I handed the file off to Jessica to reconcile. She handles our data entry. I explicitly told her to flag any unknown vendors. It seems she took it upon herself to manually force the columns to balance without verifying the vendor IDs. It's a massive oversight, obviously, and I take full responsibility for trusting a junior analyst with such critical, final stage reporting. It was a masterclass in corporate survival. Throw the subordinate under the bus, claim negligence rather than malice, and frame it all as a tragic failure of delegation. In my past life, this exact speech had destroyed me. I had stammered. I had cried. I had tried to explain that I was just doing what I was told, but I had no proof. This time, I didn't stammer. I didn't cry. I turned my head and looked directly at Brenda. That is factually incorrect. Brenda flinched. She hadn't expected pushback. She expected the quiet, reliable workhorse to fold under the pressure of corporate management. She recovered quickly, forcing a patronizing smile. "Jess, sweetheart, I know you're stressed. It's okay. We all make mistakes. I didn't make a mistake." I interrupted my voice, sharp enough to cut glass. I shifted my gaze to Sarah Jenkins. On Monday, Brenda provided me with a USB drive containing the raw Q2 data. She instructed me to alter the figures to hide a $200,000 variance routed to Apex Solutions. David gasped. Brenda slammed her hands down on the armrests. "That is an absolute lie." Brenda shrieked, her carefully cultivated professional veneer shattering instantly. "David, are you going to let her sit here and slander me? She messed up the ledger, and now she's trying to save her own skin." Sarah Jenkins raised a single manicured hand. The gesture was so commanding that Brenda snapped her mouth shut, though her chest heaved with panicked breaths. "Ms. Miller," Sarah said, her dark eyes locking onto mine, "those are very serious allegations. Do you have anything to substantiate them?" I reached into my pocket and placed the silver USB drive on the mahogany desk. It landed with a dull, heavy clink. "This drive contains 2 files," I said, calmly projecting my voice so every syllable rang clear in the tense room. "The first is the doctored ledger Brenda requested. The second is a complete forensic map of the original unaltered data, highlighting exactly how the funds were diverted. More importantly, I have a copy of the email Brenda sent me on Tuesday at 1:14 p.m. Brenda went entirely rigid. The color drained from her face, leaving her foundation looking like a pale, chalky mask. In that email, I continued unblinking. Brenda explicitly confirms her knowledge of Apex Solutions, claims they are a legacy contractor with missing ID tags, and orders me in writing to manually adjust the cells so the final columns balance for David's Friday review. "No," Brenda whispered. The word barely made it past her lips. "I didn't." Sarah Jenkins didn't wait for her to finish. She unlatched her briefcase. The metal clasps clicked loudly. She reached inside and pulled out a manila folder, sliding a single sheet of printed paper across the desk toward Brenda. "We are aware of the email, Ms. Miller," Sarah said flatly. "A copy of it was securely transmitted to our whistleblower portal this morning at 8 a.m., along with the raw data files linking Apex Solutions to an LLC registered under the name of Brenda's brother-in-law." David buried his face in his hands, letting out a long, groaning exhale. He was ruined, but he wasn't the target. Brenda stared at the printed email sitting on the desk. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and terrifyingly blank. She looked like a driver who had just realized they were heading the wrong way down a one-way highway, bracing for the inevitable, fatal impact. Denial is a fascinating human reflex. Even when the car is actively crushing your ribs, your brain tries to convince you it's just a bad dream. I watched Brenda's brain violently reject her new reality. "This is fabricated," Brenda said. Her voice was thin-reedy, lacking all of its usual booming authority. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "She forged this. Jessica hacked my email. She's jealous. She's always been jealous of me. David, you know me. I pulled in the massive accounts last year. I would never do this." David slowly lowered his hands. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Apex Solutions. Brenda, it's registered to your sister's husband. Compliance ran the background check the second the whistleblower email hit their desk this morning. The IP addresses for the shell company's bank access match your home network." The silence in the room became absolute. It wasn't the tense silence of a jury anymore. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a morgue. Brenda slumped back into the leather chair. The fight completely drained out of her, replaced by a hollow, vacant terror. The $3,000 bag resting by her feet suddenly looked like an anchor tied to a drowning woman. $200,000 isn't a rounding error. Brenda Sarah Jenkins stated, her voice as cold as absolute zero. "It is felony wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and falsification of financial records. Your employment with this company is terminated immediately effective as of 9 a.m. this morning. This—" "Sarah, please," Brenda whispered, tears finally spilling over her dark lashes. They weren't the fake, manipulative tears she had used to fire me in my past life. These were real, agonizing tears of a predator caught in a steel trap. "I can pay it back. I just needed a bridge loan. My husband made some bad investments. If you just let me quietly resign, I can wire the money back by Monday." "We are not a bank, Brenda," Sarah replied, unyielding. "We don't offer bridge loans, and we don't handle criminal matters internally." Sarah nodded to one of the silent men beside her. He pulled a sleek radio from his suit jacket, pressed the button, and spoke quietly into the mic. "Bring them up." Brenda let out a choked sob. "Bring who up, Sarah? Please don't do this. My kids, my reputation. Please." She turned to David, practically begging. David simply looked away, staring a hole into the plaster wall. Then, desperately, she turned to me. Jess, tell them. Tell them it was a mistake. You can fix the numbers. You're so good at the numbers. Please." I looked at her. I searched my soul for a drop of empathy. I searched for the quiet, subservient girl who used to shrink whenever someone raised their voice. But that girl was gone, scraped off the asphalt on a rainy night. All that was left was a cynical, hardened shell. "I did fix the numbers, Brenda," I said quietly. "I made them tell the truth." Heavy footsteps echoed outside the frosted glass. The door to David's office opened. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside, followed closely by the building's head of security. The bullpen outside erupted into frantic, hushed whispers. Through the open door, I could see Greg, standing up his coffee mug, forgotten on his desk, staring in utter disbelief. "Brenda Vance," the lead officer asked, stepping forward. Brenda shrank into the leather chair, as if trying to melt into it. No. Ma'am, please stand up." They didn't give her a choice. The officer grabbed her by the arm, pulling her to her feet. The crisp lines of her crimson dress crumpled. She wept, openly now, ugly guttural sobs that echoed violently in the small office. The officer pulled her arms behind her back. The metallic click, click, click of the handcuffs snapping into place was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of a timeline snapping back into place. It was the sound of gravity returning to my world. They marched her out of the office. I stood up and followed them to the doorway, watching as the police escorted her down the main aisle of the bullpen. Every single employee was standing. Nobody said a word. They just watched. Brenda kept her head down her meticulously styled hair, falling forward to hide her mascara-stained face. She passed my cubicle. She passed the water cooler. She passed the glass double doors of the lobby. In my previous life, I had walked that exact path. I had carried a cardboard box while Brenda watched from the comfort of her glass office, sipping an expensive latte, wearing a satisfied smirk. I had walked out into a thunderstorm, broken and destitute. Today, there was no thunderstorm. The morning sun was burning through the coastal fog, casting sharp, bright geometric shadows across the carpet. I didn't smile. I didn't cheer. There was no overwhelming surge of cinematic triumph. Instead, I just felt incredibly, wonderfully light. A crushing, suffocating weight had been lifted off my chest. Sarah Jenkins stepped up beside me, watching the elevator doors close behind the police officers. "You did the right thing, Ms. Miller," Sarah said quietly, her tone softening, just a fraction of a degree. "It takes courage to blow the whistle on a superior, especially someone as entrenched as her." "I just documented my work," I replied softly, keeping my eyes on the closed elevator doors. "Well, your documentation saved this branch from a federal indictment down the line," Sarah noted. She turned to me, offering a curt, professional nod. "David is going to need a lot of help sorting through the wreckage of her accounts. I suggest you get some coffee. It's going to be a long weekend." "I don't mind," I said. And for the first time since waking up at my desk 3 months ago, I actually meant it. I'm very good with the details. Coffee tasted different that Friday. Bitter dark and incredibly satisfying. I stood in the break room, watching the dark liquid fill my ceramic mug, listening to the frantic, hushed voices bleeding through the walls. The bullpen had devolved into a hive of paranoid speculation. Nobody was typing. Nobody was answering the phones. They were gathered in tight clusters near the water cooler, glancing nervously at the empty, dark cavern of Brenda's glass office. I took a slow sip. It burned my tongue, grounding me in the present reality. I wasn't dead. I wasn't broke. I was standing in the very building I had been marched out of in my previous life, holding a warm mug, watching the dust settle after a perfectly executed demolition. "You're awfully calm for someone who just watched their boss get hauled out in handcuffs." I turned. Greg was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed over his rumpled blue shirt. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. He was re-evaluating me. The quiet, mousy data entry girl who ate generic brand yogurt at her desk had just leveled the highest-earning manager in the regional branch. "I just gave corporate the numbers, Greg," I said, softly stepping around him to grab a paper napkin. "Numbers don't panic. They just are." Greg snorted a dry, humorless sound. "Right. Well, David is having a full-blown meltdown in the fishbowl. Sarah Jenkins practically gutted him for letting this slide under his nose. He's calling for you." I threw the napkin in the trash. "Let him wait a few minutes. I haven't finished my coffee." Greg stared at me, his eyebrows raising slightly. In the past, if David sneezed, I was there with a tissue. Now I was making the regional director wait. Greg nodded slowly, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Take your time, Jess. I think you've earned it. When I finally walked into David's office, 10 minutes later, the temperature in the room was stifling. Sarah Jenkins and her corporate team had already packed up and left to commandeer the main conference room, leaving David alone in the wreckage. He was frantically flipping through physical files, his desk a chaotic explosion of manila folders and loose paper. He looked up when I closed the door. He looked thoroughly defeated. Jessica, he breathed, collapsing heavily into his chair. Sit, please. I sat in the same chair I had occupied an hour ago. The leather was still cold. Jenkins wants a complete forensic audit of every single account Brenda touched over the last 3 years, David said, dragging a trembling hand over his face. Every vendor, every invoice, every expense report. If we don't present a clean, itemized damage report to Chicago, by the end of the month, they are going to gut this branch. They'll fire me. They'll fire half the floor. He looked at me, desperation leaking out of every pore. He wasn't asking me to help him. He was begging me to save him. That is a massive undertaking, David. I said, my voice measured and professional. Brenda managed 40% of our regional portfolio, reconciling 3 years of data without her passwords or context will require hundreds of hours of cross-referencing. I know, he pleaded, but you know her filing system better than anyone. You found the Apex Solutions discrepancy. You understand how she hid the variables. I do. I let the silence stretch. I let him feel the absolute weight of his dependency on me. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. But I am currently classified as a junior data analyst. My job description covers basic entry in weekly aggregate reporting. What you are asking for is a senior forensic auditor's workload. David blinked, temporarily, stunned by my directness. Jess, we are in a crisis, and I am willing to solve it, I interrupted smoothly. But I won't do it on a junior salary, and I won't do it from a cubicle. I want Brenda's office. I want the senior account manager title. And I want the compensation package that reflects the role I will be performing to save this branch from a federal shutdown. David's mouth opened and closed. He looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger. And he was. The girl who would have worked 80-hour weeks for a pat on the head and a pizza party was dead. I can't authorize a promotion of that scale without corporate approval, he stammered. Sarah Jenkins respects results, I countered. Call her. Tell her you've appointed an internal lead to spearhead the forensic scrub, someone who already demonstrated the competence to catch the fraud. She won't care about the title or the salary. She only cares about stopping the bleeding. David stared at the chaotic mess of papers on his desk, then at the empty guest chair where Brenda had sat in handcuffs. He swallowed hard. Okay, Jess. Move your things into the office today. I'll draft the title change for HR. I stood up. I'll have a preliminary damage assessment on your desk by Monday morning. I walked out of his office. The bullpen was still buzzing, but I ignored it. I walked directly to my cubicle, grabbed a cardboard box, and began packing my few personal items. My coffee mug, a small potted succulent, the framed photo of my cat. Greg popped his head over the partition. Fired? He asked, genuine concern briefly flashing across his face. Promoted, I said, simply. I picked up the box and walked past him, heading straight for the glass-walled office at the end of the aisle. I opened the door. The heavy floral stench of Brenda's expensive perfume still lingered in the air. I walked over to the thermostat, cranked the AC, and propped the door open to air it out. I sat down in the plush leather chair. I ran my hands over the smooth mahogany of the desk. I looked out through the glass walls at the bullpen below. August 14th arrived 3 weeks later, the day I was supposed to die. I didn't take a gig delivering food. I didn't drive in the rain. I sat in my new spacious apartment, paid for by my substantial salary increase, and watched the thunderstorm lash against the thick glass of my living room window. Lightning fractured the sky, illuminating the city in harsh, brief flashes of silver. I poured myself a glass of expensive red wine. I sat on my sofa, listening to the violent drum of the rain, entirely safe, entirely dry. The timeline had tried to break me, but I had broken it instead. October blew into the city with a bitter, biting chill. The leaves on the maple trees lining the avenue had turned the color of dried blood, brittle and ready to fall. I sat in a sterile, windowless conference room in a law firm downtown. The air smelled of lemon pledge and expensive leather. Across from me sat Sarah Jenkins, calmly reviewing a stack of legal documents. Beside her was a young, sharp-eyed corporate attorney hired by the company. We were waiting for the deposition. Brenda hadn't gone quietly. After the initial shock wore off, her survival instincts had kicked in. She had hired an aggressive defense attorney who immediately tried to muddy the waters, filing motions to suppress the digital evidence and claiming that I had fabricated the email to steal her job. It was a desperate, flailing strategy, but in the realm of white-collar crime, delaying the inevitable was often the best a lawyer could do. The heavy wooden door clicked open. Brenda walked in. I kept my face perfectly neutral, but internally, the shock was profound. The polished, untouchable predator from May was completely gone. She looked small. Her tailored designer suits had been replaced by a baggy, generic beige blouse and dark slacks. Her meticulously dyed blonde hair showed an inch of dark gray threaded roots. The fake tan had faded, leaving her skin sallow and exhausted. The dark circles under her eyes were bruised and heavy. Speaking of months of sleepless nights, she didn't look at me. She kept her eyes glued to the polished grain of the conference table as she took her seat beside her lawyer, a harried-looking man in a cheap suit. Her husband had filed for divorce 2 weeks after her arrest, freezing their joint assets to protect himself from the federal seizure orders. She had lost the house. She had lost the $3,000 bags. She had lost the illusion. "Let's get this on the record," the corporate attorney said, smoothly, clicking a digital recorder on the table. For the next 2 hours, I sat in silence, while Brenda's lawyer threw every pathetic defense he could muster against the wall. He questioned my credentials. He questioned the security of the company's internal servers. He suggested that because I was the one who manually altered the final ledger, I was the sole mastermind of the fraud. Sarah Jenkins dismantled him with surgical precision. She produced the server logs, the IP addresses tracing the Apex Solutions bank accounts to Brenda's personal laptop, the metadata from the original, unaltered Excel file proving Brenda had created it, and finally, the printed screenshot of the email. "Your client explicitly instructed Ms. Miller to alter financial documents to obscure a missing $200,000. Sarah stated, her voice echoing coldly in the small room. "We have the timestamps. We have the digital fingerprint. If this goes to a jury, Ms. Miller will testify exactly to what happened, supported by undeniable forensic evidence. The prosecution will not ask for leniency. Brenda's lawyer sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. He leaned over, covering his microphone, and whispered fiercely into Brenda's ear. Brenda squeezed her eyes shut. A single tear escaped, tracking slowly down her pale cheek. She looked up, and for the first time since walking into the room, she met my gaze. There was no anger left in her eyes, no arrogance, just a hollow, desperate pleading. She wanted me to fix it. Even now, after everything, she wanted the quiet, data entry girl to take the blame, to smooth over the glitch in her life, to save her. I looked back at her. I didn't offer a sympathetic smile. I didn't frown. I just stared at her with the absolute chilling apathy she deserved. She was a stranger to me now, just a variable in a spreadsheet that had finally been corrected. Brenda's shoulders collapsed. The last remaining fight drained out of her, leaving nothing but an empty shell. "My client," her lawyer said, clearing his throat and sitting back up, "is prepared to discuss a plea arrangement. In exchange for avoiding a protracted trial, she will plead guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and provide full restitution." Sarah Jenkins didn't smile, but a glint of absolute finality settled in her eyes. "The state will recommend 36 months in federal lockup. No early parole." Brenda let out a small, pathetic whimper, burying her face in her hands. 36 months. 3 years. Her life as she knew it was entirely, irreparably over. The deposition wrapped up shortly after. The legal formalities were just white noise to me at that point. The battle was over. The war was won. I walked out of the law firm and onto the bustling Chicago sidewalk. The wind whipped past me, biting at my cheeks, but I didn't pull my coat tighter. I let the cold air hit me. It felt bracing. It felt real. I walked toward the subway station, my heels clicking a steady, confident rhythm against the concrete. I didn't look back at the towering glass building where Brenda was signing her life away. I didn't care what happened to her anymore. The hatred that had fueled me, that had kept me awake for weeks, had finally burned itself out, leaving behind a clean, solid foundation. I pulled my phone from my pocket. An email notification popped up. It was from David. "Jess Corporate just approved the Q4 budget you restructured. Fantastic work. Jenkins wants you to fly out to Chicago next month to present your forensic auditing model to the other regional branches. Let's touch base on Monday." I smiled. A real, genuine smile. I wasn't a victim anymore. I wasn't collateral damage. I was the architect of my own life, and the numbers finally added up exactly the way I wanted them to. Winter arrived with a brutal, unapologetic freeze. Ice coated the outer panes of my office glass, distorting the city skyline into jagged watercolor smears of gray and steel. Inside, the ambient temperature was a perfect, regulated 70 degrees. I sat at my mahogany desk, reviewing the final restructuring protocols for the Q1 transition. The soft hum of my computer tower was the only sound in the room. My phone buzzed quietly against the wood. A calendar alert illuminated the screen. "Brenda, sentencing hearing, 2 p.m. I closed my laptop. I didn't legally need to be there. The state had secured the plea deal weeks ago, cutting through the red tape of a prolonged trial. There would be no dramatic cross-examinations, no surprise witnesses pointing fingers. Just a judge stamping a piece of paper and a pair of federal bailiffs escorting a broken woman through a side door. But I needed to see it. I needed to watch the final grain of sand drop through the hourglass. Greg knocked twice on my open door before leaning in. He held a thick stack of finalized vendor contracts, dropping them heavily into my outbox. He smiled a genuine relaxed expression that erased the deep stress lines he used to carry around. "These are ready for your signature, boss," he said, tapping the paper. "Also, the team is heading down to O'Malley's around 5. First round is on David assuming his corporate retention bonus actually cleared. You in." I looked at Greg. In my past life, he had been a passive, exhausted observer to my execution. In this life, he was a loyal deputy. It wasn't because he was inherently good or bad. It was simply because the power dynamic dictated his loyalty. People adapt to gravity. I was the center of gravity now. "I'll try to swing by," I said, standing up and slipping my arms into my heavy wool trench coat. "I have an errand to run downtown first." Greg glanced at the wall clock, then back to me. A flicker of understanding crossed his face. He knew exactly what today was. Closure. Accountability. I corrected, gently. He nodded once, tapping his knuckles against the doorframe. "See you at O'Malley's, Jess." The federal courthouse was a monolith of limestone and dark oak. It smelled of harsh floor wax, old paper, and anxious sweat. The air inside the courtroom felt heavy, suffocatingly formal. I slipped into the back row of Gallery B, just as the bailiff called the room to order my dark coat, blending into the shadows of the rear benches. Brenda stood at the defense table. She wore a flat generic gray pantsuit that hung loosely on her diminished frame. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a severe, joyless clip at the nape of her neck. She looked entirely unremarkable. That was the most jarring part of all. Stripped of the designer labels, the stolen money, and the unearned predatory arrogance, she was just an ordinary, desperate person who had made an incredibly stupid choice. The judge, a stern woman with thick reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose, shuffled a stack of manila folders. She didn't offer a grand speech. She didn't moralize or lecture. The machinery of justice was completely devoid of emotion. It only processed facts and statutes. In the matter of the state versus the defendant, the judge began her voice, dry and mechanical. She read the charges: wire fraud, embezzlement of corporate funds. The plea agreement was formally entered into the permanent record. The court accepts the negotiated plea. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 36 months in a federal correctional facility, followed by 5 years of supervised release. Full financial restitution in the amount of $212,000 is ordered. The gavel fell with a sharp, wooden crack. It wasn't a loud noise, but it echoed violently in my chest. It was the exact opposite of the sickening crunch of a car bumper against bone. It was the sound of a fractured timeline finally sealing itself shut. Brenda didn't cry this time. She just nodded, vaguely, her eyes glazed over, staring at a scuff mark on the wooden floor. The bailiff stepped forward, flanking her on both sides. As they turned her toward the secure side exit, her gaze swept across the sparse gallery. She saw me. For a fraction of a second, the deadness in her eyes shifted. A tiny, agonizing spark of recognition flared. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even regret. It was a haunting, terrible realization of exactly what she had thrown away. She had dug a shallow grave meant for me, and I had simply handed her the shovel. I didn't break eye contact. I didn't offer a triumphant smile. And I didn't glare. I just watched her with absolute, unyielding calm. The heavy oak door swung shut behind her, clicking firmly into its frame. Gone. I walked out of the courthouse and onto the wide concrete steps. The late November wind was biting, slicing sharply through the wool of my coat, but I welcomed the sting. I pulled a pair of leather gloves from my pocket and slipped them on. Traffic snarled on the street below. Yellow cabs honked angrily at pedestrians. People rushed past on the sidewalk, entirely consumed by their own tiny chaotic universes. The world hadn't stopped spinning just because Brenda went to prison. The universe didn't care about justice or karma. The universe only cared about cause and effect. In my first life, I had allowed myself to be an effect, a passive object acted upon by outside forces. I had believed that keeping my head down, doing good work, and staying quiet would be a shield. It wasn't. Weakness in a corporate ecosystem isn't seen as a virtue. It's seen as an open invitation to be consumed. I stopped at the corner crosswalk. The light was red. A heavy commercial delivery truck rumbled past its massive tires, kicking up a spray of icy slush from the gutter. I watched it go, feeling the rhythmic, steady thump of my own heartbeat in my chest. There was no phantom pain, no lingering echo of crushed ribs or fading vision. The terrified girl who died on that rain-slicked highway was finally, truly at peace. The pedestrian light flipped to a glowing white figure. I stepped off the curb and walked forward, blending smoothly into the crowd, entirely alive, entirely awake, and perfectly in control of my own steps. Thank you for sticking with me through this entire journey. Reborn isn't just about second chances. It's about learning how to build your boundaries with bricks instead of paper. If you enjoyed this deeply grounded revenge story, please drop a like and leave a comment below. Tell me about a time you finally stood up for yourself at work or in life. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that standing your ground is always worth it. I'll see you in the next story.